Welcome back to the History Lounge. Today we're covering the history of capitalism. So for some reason, people prefer a simple but wrong answer to a complicated correct one. So we will take a look at the history of capitalism, look at both its positives and its negatives using facts and statistics. So let's get into it. There are so many different versions of capitalism in use today, so I'll just explain the main features which are used in all of them. At its core, capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production for profit. Means of production refers to the resources, including money and other forms of capital. Under a capitalist economy, the economy runs through individuals who own and operate private companies. Decisions over the use of resources are made by the individuals or individuals who own the companies. In a capitalist economy, capital assets such as factories, mines, and railroads can be privately owned and controlled. Labor is purchased for money wages. Capital gains accrue to private owners, and prices allocate capital and labor between competing uses. It requires a market economy which distributes goods and services according to the laws of supply and demand. Competition between companies is a major part. Consumers vote for the winners and losers with their wallet. Companies who provide a bad product, a bad experience, overpricing, or are unpopular for social or political reasons will eventually go out of business as consumers spend their money at one of their competitors instead. The winner in that case will make more profit, which they can then use to expand the business, innovate, or buy other businesses in order to gain a larger share of the market or to streamline the operation of their business. As Steve Jobs said, you can't just ask customers what they want and then try to give that to them. By the time you get it built, they'll want something new. Capitalism comes in many different varieties, too many to go through in this video, but it's worth noting that every Western country that you may think of as capitalist is actually a mixed economy, as some or all of them will have things like welfare, public education, pensions, and government-owned companies. You can imagine it as a line with full capitalism on one side, meaning 100% private control of the economy, and full socialism on the other side with 100% government control of the economy, with most countries being aligned somewhere near the middle or more towards the capitalist side in most cases. Denmark and Sweden, which often get called socialist countries, are in fact capitalist market-based economies with more government aid, government-funded healthcare and education, and higher taxes to pay for them. But both countries are market economies. Keep in mind that Denmark is the third easiest country to start a business in, and Sweden is home to IKEA, which made 37 billion euros in 2018. Chances are, if you have the ability to watch this video right now on whatever device you may be using, it's thanks to capitalism, as your internet service provider is a for-profit business. And so is YouTube, and so is the company that built the device you're watching this on. So that's worth remembering before posting on Twitter that capitalism sucks from your iPhone. Up until the 16th century, most of the world lived in a feudal system, in which a country had many regions with their own self-supporting economic systems, basically like mini economies, in which a vast number of peasants worked the land for a feudal lord, in exchange for the right to build a shelter and keep a small amount of what they produce for themselves, the rest of it going to the lord as rent payment. The small amount of produce they had left over could be traded in the town market for other goods or services. The lord and his family would also purchase certain goods, although some of their wealth would be given in tax or tribute to the monarchy, who were the ruling class within the country. Trade outside your region or outside your country was limited, and so was the amount of money in circulation. The majority of people lived in poverty, and upwards mobility was severely restricted unless you were born into a privileged family. This particularly hurt women. However, this started to change in the 16th century when foreign trade increased, with the new merchant capitalists buying goods in foreign lands only to bring them home to sell at a profit, mainly to the wealthy landowners who could afford such goods. As these goods were subjected to taxation, the ruling class caught on to the fact that this was increasingly bringing in more and more money. So many countries, mainly European, started to expand in order to increase trade and secure more resources in order to fuel further expansion. This was known as merchant capitalism and resulted in the world's first conglomerate known as the British East India Company, which grew to an absolutely enormous size due to it having a monopoly on trade and allowing people to buy stock in the company so that they could also share in the wealth that was created. As mercantilism started to decline in the mid-18th century, particularly in Great Britain, a new type of capitalism started to rise: industrial capitalism. As the Industrial Revolution kicked off with many factories opening up, especially within the textile industry, this resulted in industrialists replacing merchants as the dominant players in the capitalist system. These factories often required large workforces which were drawn from the countryside, resulting in many people moving into the cities in order to work at a factory in exchange for a wage, which they could then use to pay for their rent or food, or maybe some luxuries like new clothes or alcohol. The factories were owned by the industrialists, who understood that having a centralized workforce which was sorted into specialty roles resulted in high productivity, which could then be overseen by a foreman or supervisor to make sure the work was being completed correctly and efficiently. Goods produced in these factories were sold at a profit, with the owner taking the largest share and smaller amounts of money going to those lower and lower within the company. Although upwards mobility was possible within these companies, the owner or owners also held most of the risk, as if the business failed, they would lose all the capital they had invested in order to start the company. Innovation became valuable as a new technology. Machinery or manufacturing processes could allow more goods to be produced without increasing the workforce, meaning that higher profits could be achieved. This is a fundamental part of capitalism, as companies compete with each other to ensure higher profits through innovation, which often results in many of these innovations benefiting society as a whole. The finance industry also grew out of this, with banks helping contribute to economic growth through financing and credit, but also with the introduction of paper money, which was tied to the gold reserves initially, checks, and overdrafts. Trade continued to increase, and as the economies of scale started to kick in as the companies grew larger and larger, they continued to produce more and more goods, creating more wealth, especially for the industrialists, but also increasing the amount of people being hired into the factories. As the 20th century rolled by, capitalism continued to expand as globalization increased, but it also faced new challenges such as large monopolies and trusts, which often used uncompetitive practices in order to keep or expand their monopoly over a certain industry. Many workers also wanted to be treated better, especially in regards to fair pay and safety, often prompting governments to create new rules and regulations regarding safety, and also stopping unpopular practices like child labor, which up until that point had been common to a certain degree. As the 20th century continued, new laws were introduced, such as the minimum wage law, some environmental regulations, and the abandoning of the gold standard, as it was considered too restrictive on the economy by limiting the amount of money in circulation. Capitalism has continued to expand as global trade has increased, and also as wealth has increased, with more and more countries embracing capitalism, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1991. It seems that the biggest appeals to most people were the ideas of the individual, self-responsibility, upwards mobility, and private ownership. In the feudal system, you essentially had two classes of people: the rich elite minority comprising of the landowners and the ruling class, and then everybody else, which were the peasants working the land for minimal compensation with little chance of moving up in society. Capitalism created the three-class system most of us know today, often a smaller lower class, a larger middle class, which often gets broken into three groups, and a small upper class, usually with an ultra-rich at the very top, which are the wealthiest individuals in the nation. Many people will move within these classes. You may grow up in the lower class and then retire in the upper class, or do the complete opposite. You can pursue any career you desire if your education in that field is sufficient. and you are able to live as an individual, spending your own money as you see fit. This one is tricky to answer, because as we discussed earlier, all developed countries use a mixed economy, so what may be considered as a con in one country may not be an issue in another country. But I will try sum this up generally speaking, and looking through a historical lens from the 19th century until now. Let's start with the cons, and these are the main ones that I see most economists agreeing on. Capitalism encourages and creates monopolies, although it certainly isn't the only system that does this. It is something that always seems to happen though, as companies continue to expand in the hopes of achieving higher and higher profits so they can eventually push out or buy out all of their competition. This leads to a monopoly, when one company is dominant within an industry and has little to no competition at all. This often leads to them exploiting this power by raising prices, as consumers have no choice but to pay the higher price, and also discourages them from innovating. Adding to this, capitalism often causes the majority of the wealth to be accumulated by a small minority of the population. This is because those in the middle class, and especially those in the lower class, do not have enough leftover income to invest and grow their wealth, while the upper class, especially the ultra-rich, invest the vast amount of their wealth, which in turn gives them even more wealth. A free market with limited regulations often results in many companies maximizing profits at the cost of the environment, society, workers, or even the consumers, like with the social media companies, in which the companies do what will make them money but may also damage social structure or cause other problems in society. Although oftentimes, especially in more recent years, companies are much more aware of their image, so they often regulate themselves in certain ways, as a few bad stories in the news can heavily damage their brand, although some of these abuses still do take place, but far out of the public eye. Capitalism relies on consumption and spending to exist. If nobody is buying anything, then the whole system falls down. This creates a huge amount of consumerism in society in order for people to buy, as the money in the bank isn't useful to the economy. This is also the incentive for those with more money to constantly invest that money rather than hold it in their bank account. Capitalism focuses on able-bodied individuals. If someone is unable to be productive, either because of an injury or disability, then they no longer have an ability to contribute. These individuals get left behind, as they may not be able to find a place in society, although I have seen many disabled people handing out flyers and blind people giving massages, so this isn't always the case. Many people also consider the boom and bust cycle to be a con, although through my research it seems like this is less about capitalism itself and more about how it is regulated. And also the race to the bottom idea that businesses will only pay workers the absolute minimum necessary, which is somewhat true, but it misses the point that skilled or loyal workers can also seek other employment in order to get better working conditions or wages, and smart managers will give them raises to avoid that. Now onto the main pros of capitalism, generally speaking once again. Certainly the first one is freedom. Economic freedom helps political freedom, as if the government controls the means of production, it creates a large bureaucracy which inevitably extends into other areas of society, as we have seen historically time after time. Capitalism is based on people having the freedom to choose goods and services which best meet their needs. This creates supply and demand. They are in control of their own destiny, and many people have seen huge upwards mobility in a capitalist country, rising from the lower class all the way to the upper class. This extends further, as everyone within a capitalist society is working to make or serve others in society in some way. You may help build the appliance that others need in their homes, or provide a service such as fixing something broken in their house, and everyone has a part to play as the economy grows. Innovation within a capitalist society far outweighs any innovation done within any other economic system, which is why we have seen such a rapid rise in innovation and new technology through the 20th and 21st centuries. Companies must innovate in order to stay competitive and to stay profitable, and this occurs at every level of the company. Speaking of competition, this is also a great part of capitalism, as companies need to compete in order to sell products to the consumers. This is through competitive pricing, innovation, and efficiency, as they want to avoid costly waste within the company if they wish to sell their products at the lowest price possible while still making a profit. It also provides a wide range of products and services, as different people have different needs. If there is value in the goods and services being offered, defined as being able to solve a problem, then it will continue to operate, which results in a society with wide-ranging products and services, especially by comparison to countries which have government-run economies. A big factor that is often overlooked is the predictability within a capitalist economy. Although they do have their bumps in the road, sometimes big ones, it is usually stable, especially by comparisons to other economic systems which can suffer from many big issues or just collapse entirely. To answer this, we need to look at a number of different factors. Let's first talk about GDP per person in the United States and Europe. At the turn of the 19th century, it was around $2,500 per person, and today the US is at almost $60,000 per person and $25,000 per person in Europe. In 1820, almost 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, only around 10% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty. And this rate is even lower in Europe, which has seen the most dramatic fall, down to 1.6% of the population living in extreme poverty. Famine, which has historically caused the deaths of so much of humanity, killed 1,400 people per 100,000 worldwide in 1870. 100 years later, that had plummeted to 100 people per 100,000. Through the invention and innovation of household utilities and appliances such as the washing machine, dishwasher, and vacuum cleaner, the average person today spends 25 hours per week on housework compared to the 60 hours per week that you would spend back in 1890. Innovation and competition have also meant that since 1948, when a 16-inch television cost $795 or about $12,000 today, which was actually about 25% of the average worker's annual salary, now you can buy a 50 or 65-inch 4K LED TV for around $500 or under 1% of the average worker's annual salary. So capitalism has led to vastly higher per capita incomes, resulting in a dramatic reduction in poverty, while letting people enjoy more of their lives and buy more consumer goods and luxuries compared to previous generations. However, there have been some downsides. As mentioned earlier, wealth and income inequality seems to be the biggest issue, although it isn't a new one with capitalism, as back in 1906, 20% of the Italian population owned 80% of the country's land, so this has been a constant issue within capitalist economies. Inequality isn't inherently a bad thing, as those that are educated, work hard, and innovate should be rewarded more than those who don't. But the staggering discrepancies between the very rich and the poor, especially in the United States, is certainly an issue. Historically, when you look at national income inequality in the US, it actually peaked all the way back in 1928, before the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war Marshall Plan era brought it down to the lowest levels, before it eventually started to go up again. Although it did still go down at certain points, but today it is almost as high as it was in 1928, and looks like it will continue to rise. Please keep in mind that globally, poor people are getting richer faster than any other group, especially when you look at Africa. Nigeria is a good example, or in Asia, India being a good example. So this seems to be more dependent on the country's implementation of capitalism rather than capitalism itself. Capitalism certainly has had a negative effect on the environment, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, when very few environmental regulations were in place. Industrial companies had no interest in protecting the environment if it meant reducing profit, which led to some horrible environmental damage. However, this has also been the case in socialist countries like the USSR. Over the past 40 years, and increasingly so more recently, there has been much more regulation to protect the environment, and the public has been increasingly aware and holding accountable companies who do unnecessary environmental damage. This will continue and hopefully minimize this issue moving forward. Crony capitalism or corporatism is also an issue. Again, this isn't just seen within capitalist countries, as it is very prevalent within socialist countries, but it's still a major issue. This is when companies manipulate the government to benefit themselves, such as getting the government to give them tax breaks or government contracts, limiting their competition, or ignoring monopolistic behavior. This is more often an issue in countries that have very high amounts of corruption, as capitalist countries with low levels of corruption, like my home, New Zealand, have very little to non-existent levels of crony capitalism occurring. Capitalism still creates monopolies, which are never a good thing, but every developed country has a department or ministry that stops monopolies from occurring when it can, often leading to duopolies in many cases, or when that isn't possible, they regulate the monopoly in a way in which its negative effects can be minimized. So this one isn't really as much of an issue in developed countries, although it still can be a big issue in developing countries. So has capitalism been a good thing or a bad thing? I leave this question to you. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I'll be doing a companion video to this one looking at socialism, which I've studied very heavily and read many books by Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Karl Marx, and many others, and I'll approach it with the same questions and open-mindedness as I did with this video. I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.